What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Flight Risk. Directed by Mel Gibson and written by Jared Rosenberg, this film stars people like Michelle Dockery, Mark Wahlberg, Topher Grace, and many more. And before we get too far into this video, if you're a fan of things like up-to-date reviews for movies like this one, retrospective reviews, live streams, early reviews, and the occasional vlog, then you're in the right place, and I'd like to ask you to consider subscribing. But if you're a returning viewer, well, thanks so much for coming back. And today we're going to be talking about Flight Risk, which is coming from director Mel Gibson. Now, he's somebody I've been a huge fan of for a very long time, whether it be things like Passion of the Christ, Braveheart, Apocalypto, so many films that he's done that I honestly really enjoy. And it's been almost 10 years since his last film, Hacksaw Ridge, which is also a film I enjoyed quite a bit. So going into this movie, I was excited. You have an all-star cast and you have a director that I really admire at the helm. And so with all that said, before we get into my thoughts on the movie, let's get into what this film is all about, and then we'll get into my thoughts. Flight Risk focuses on the character of Madeline, played by Michelle Dockery, who's a marshal who goes after the character of Winston, played by Topher Grace, who is an accountant for a big crime boss. He's hiding in Alaska. They end up finding him. He says, let's make a deal so he can avoid prosecution, and they end up saying, okay, cool, we're going to transport you back to the States so that you can testify against this big crime boss. And they get a pilot so that they can fly them from Alaska to the States. Except the pilot that they hired does not show up, but the person that is pretending to be the pilot is Mark Wahlberg's character, who turns out to be somebody who's working for this crime boss, who's there to kill Winston, and is also a bit of a psychopath as well. So now what you have is this psychopath, a marshal, and this witness that are all on this plane all together, and this really small kind of rickety plane, and they're making their way to the States. And as time goes on, they start to uncover that something is a little fishy here. That's the base premise here, and the whole film takes place on this plane outside of the very beginning and the very end of the film. And so it's a chamber piece, which are very tricky films to do. You want to make sure with films like this that the dialogue, the performances, the characters in general are interesting, and that the events that take place in this very limited space are interesting. And I think when a chamber piece is done incredibly well, it can be some of the most exciting storytelling, and it can really showcase how you don't need a bunch of locations, you don't need a whole bunch to tell a really interesting and exciting story, and it's those films that really prove it. But if a chamber piece is boring or isn't as interesting, it unfortunately leaves you in a place where you think, okay, well, they needed to have branched out a little bit more. But when I saw Mel Gibson was directing the film, it definitely gave me a greater sense of ease going into this film, that it would be one of the better chamber piece films. With that said, what I can start this off by saying is I think it's a competently made film. I think that the cinematography for the most part here is pretty solid, and I think the cast does a good job here too. You know, I think they all give pretty solid performances. Mark Wahlberg is definitely hamming it up here as this big over-the-top psychopath character that is balding on top. The look there is interesting. It was definitely a choice, and I don't think the bald cap they gave him was overly convincing. I don't know why they went with that choice, but Mark Wahlberg is definitely hamming it up with his performance here. He's an actor who can give samey performances at times, but for the most part, whether it be in comedic or in dramatic roles, I have enjoyed him quite a bit. So I enjoyed kind of seeing him play this psychopath killer in this movie. Michelle Dockery is somebody I was really excited to see in this film. I actually just recently did an entire binge of all of the Downton Abbey TV show and the movies with my wife, who had never seen them before. I'm a huge fan of that show, and she's one of the main characters. So if you've seen that, you know that she obviously has a very nice, eloquent English accent. And so hearing her here with an American accent, honestly, I haven't seen her in a bunch of things that she's done with an American accent. I know she's done some things, but I haven't really seen a lot of those. So it was a little distracting for me, but it was nice to see her in a big movie like this. And I thought for the most part, her performance was pretty solid. I don't think she does anything incredible, but I think for the most part, she's pretty solid here. And then Topher Grace brings that Topher Grace humor to the role here. I don't think he's doing anything that we haven't seen him do in other action comedy or action dramas in the past, but for the most part, I think he's an enjoyable character here, and he brings that nervous kind of wit and charm that he usually brings to his other performances. I don't think Mark Wahlberg, Michelle Dockery, or Topher Grace are necessarily stepping out of their comfort zone with this film, but I think for the most part, they service the film with their performances. Outside of that, because it is limited in its location and its space, the film does have a lot of entertaining beats. There's a lot of moments that are pretty exciting to watch, but as you can tell already, I explained what this film is all about, and that's because it was in the trailer. Otherwise, my mom, for instance, who had not seen the trailer, went into this with a little bit more surprise. And so for the sake of doing a review, of course, if you look at the synopsis, if you watch the trailer, it tells you what this film is about. And my mom had the benefit of going into it blind. So I do think it's one of those things where the marketing of this film showcases so much about what this film is about that removed so much surprise for somebody like myself and my wife who watched the film, who had already seen so much of the marketing for this film, which ultimately left this movie feeling like an entertaining enough ride that didn't really have a lot of twists and turns. And that's honestly how I feel about it on a narrative level. This film is pretty straightforward. There isn't an abundance to it on a story level. There isn't an abundance to it on a character level. I would say Michelle Dockery's character is the one you get to learn a little bit more about as time goes on. There are a number of moments throughout the course of the film where she calls different individuals who work for the marshals, that work with her crew of people in law enforcement. There's a pilot that she has a phone call with over the course of the film when she needs help kind of steering the plane. And outside of those characters, we only really focus on the three that are on the plane. So there are a couple of moments where we get to peek behind the curtain a little bit at these characters, but the film doesn't really do an abundance to really give them many layers, nor does the events on the plane ever really take it to the next level. Unfortunately, I think this is a film that was sabotaged by its marketing, because I think had I gone into this with no knowledge on what the film was really going to turn out to be, I maybe would have had a couple of moments where I was like, oh, I didn't see that coming, or I could start to try to decipher what's going to happen. But ultimately, you have a film that was given away in the marketing, and it leaves everything else that's in the movie that's not in the marketing to just be very predictable. It was very convenient, it was very predictable, it was straightforward. You could see where this film was going from the very beginning to the very end. There really wasn't much to it that really took it to that next level. But what I will say is I was entertained. I won't sit here and lie that I wasn't entertained. My mom seemed to enjoy the film quite a bit. My wife and I were both more on the middle of the fence when it came down to it. I don't think any of the performers here are giving a bad performance. I think the overall look of the film is fine. It's a competently made film. But this is the kind of thing where if I think the movie had ended and somebody said, okay, what director directed that? Mel Gibson would have never been the answer for me. And I think because he's set the bar so high for himself as a director, and he's given us films that are so impressive on character, story, special effects, and just overall tone, this film just felt like it was lacking something. It felt very much like a film that would be thrown straight to streaming and would be kind of forgotten about in a month, which is a shame to say. I think my heart hurts a little bit more watching this movie and feeling this way because I love Mel Gibson as a director all that much. And so it left me a little bit torn. On the writing side of things, this film is written by Jared Rosenberg, and this is actually the first film he's ever written. And I can definitely feel that watching this film. You know, hey, listen, we all got to start somewhere. But I think with a director like Mel Gibson, having a first-time film writer maybe wasn't the best choice, because it left me with this weird taste in my mouth and a little bit of a fear for that upcoming Passion of the Christ sequel that Mel Gibson is going to be working on. Now, I'm not going into that with any sort of real stress or worry, because I'm sure he's going to work with a really strong team to make it feel great, you know, like the original Passion of the Christ. But, you know, seeing this be his next effort after something as incredible as Hacksaw Ridge was a little bit disappointing, because so much about it just felt so generic. So much about it felt so just competently made. That's about as best as I can really praise this film. There isn't a layer to this film that ever makes it feel like a piece of real fun art. You know, it feels like it's got some fun little sequences of action or tension, but I never felt scared for the characters. I never found myself glued to the characters. I never found myself glued to the story. More than anything, I was watching the film play out and I was just like, this is entertaining enough. You know, it's entertaining enough to drink some soda and eat some popcorn, but not something I could see myself revisiting. And especially in the filmography of Mel Gibson, there are so many other films, whether the ones that he's acted in or the films that he's directed, that I would much rather watch than this one. And it's just a shame. You know, I was really excited, especially with how good the last film he made was. So as you can tell, I don't really have an abundance more to say on this one, so I'm going to come to a close here. I think that Flight Risk, unfortunately, is just a generic action movie that takes place in one location with pretty generic characters coming from a really top tier director, which makes it all that more disappointing. But I don't think it's a bad film. I don't think it's terrible by any means. I just don't think it's anything substantial or anything that's really all that great, but it was entertaining enough. That's the best way I'll put it. So that's going to be my thoughts on Flight Risk, and I look forward to hearing various opinions. Are you a big fan of Mel Gibson? Were you also a little bit disappointed that this film didn't necessarily meet the same quality standards as his other films? Whatever the case may be, leave any and all comments down below, and I look forward to hearing all the various discussions down below. Bye-bye.